Frank Wilkins sat alone at his usual table by the window in Mary's diner. The morning sun highlighted the deep lines on his weathered face as he sipped his black coffee. At 67, Frank's body showed the marks of his 30 years of military service: silver hair cut short, a slight limp when he walked, and hands that sometimes shook when he was tired. But his eyes remained sharp, missing nothing that happened around him. "More coffee, Frank?" Mary asked, holding the pot above his nearly empty cup. "Thank you, ma'am," he replied with a nod, his voice low and gravelly from years of barking orders to Marines under his command. Frank had been living in the small town of Pinewood for almost 7 years now. After his wife Sarah passed away from cancer, he couldn't bear to stay in their old house filled with memories. He sold most of their belongings, packed what remained into his old Ford truck, and drove until he found Pinewood, a quiet place where nobody knew him or his past. The locals eventually learned he was a decorated Marine veteran, though Frank never spoke about his service. He didn't wear military caps or jackets covered in patches like some veterans. The only sign of his military past was the USNC tattoo on his forearm and the disciplined way he carried himself. Frank worked 3 days a week at Wilson's hardware store, stocking shelves and helping customers find what they needed. The rest of his time was spent keeping his small house in order, tending to his garden, and caring for the special memorial corner he had created for Sarah. Their wedding photo sat among flowering plants that she had loved when she was alive. "Weather report says storm coming in tomorrow," said Bill, the diner's cook, as he wiped down the counter. Frank nodded. "Miney's been telling me the same thing since yesterday." This was Frank's life now, simple, quiet, and predictable. He liked it that way. After decades of chaos and danger, peace was all he wanted. The town respected his privacy and appreciated his helping hand whenever someone needed assistance with home repairs or mechanical problems. That morning, as Frank finished his breakfast, the diner's bell jingled. The comfortable murmur of conversation suddenly stopped. Frank didn't turn around immediately, but he noticed how Mary's friendly smile disappeared as she looked toward the door. 3 large men in leather vests walked in, their heavy boots thudding against the wooden floor. The patches on their backs showed a scorpion with the words "Desert Scorpions MC" curved above it. The tallest one, with a thick beard and arms covered in tattoos, scanned the diner with cold eyes before leading the others to a booth across from Frank's table. "Looks like trouble," whispered Edith, an elderly woman sitting at the counter. "Never seen those types around here before." Frank continued eating his eggs, not looking up but aware of every movement the newcomers made. The town hadn't seen a real motorcycle club before, at least not since Frank had lived there. The way these men carried themselves wasn't just tough, it was threatening. "Hey, sweetheart," called the bearded one to Mary, who was trying to avoid their table. "Some coffee over here. And make it quick." Mary hurried over with the coffee pot, her hands slightly shaking. As she poured, the man grabbed her wrist. "What's the rush? Don't you want to chat a little?" he asked with a smirk that made Mary's face flush with discomfort. Frank set down his fork, watching the interaction from the corner of his eye. 7 years of peace had been good, but something told him that the calm days in Pinewood were about to end. "Let me go, please," Mary said quietly, trying to pull her wrist from the biker's grip. The bearded man laughed and looked at his friends. "Hear that?" she said, "please. At least they got manners in this hick town." Frank's coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down slowly, the gentle clink against the saucer drawing the attention of a few nearby diners who knew him well enough to recognize the careful control in his movements. "I'm just trying to do my job," Mary said, her voice stronger now despite her obvious fear. "And I'm just trying to be friendly," the biker replied, tightening his grip. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Frank stood up. He didn't move quickly or aggressively, just rose to his full height and turned to face the biker's table. Though not as large as the 3 men, there was something in his posture that made several customers hold their breath. "The lady asked you to let her go," Frank said, his voice calm but carrying clearly through the now silent diner. The bearded man looked up, his eyes narrowing as he took in Frank's appearance. "Mind your own business, old man." "Mary is serving me breakfast," Frank replied. "That makes it my business." The 2 other bikers shifted in their seats, one of them pushing his jacket back to reveal a knife on his belt. The bearded one, clearly their leader, finally released Mary's wrist with a dismissive shove. "Sorry about Spike," said one of the other bikers with a mocking smile. He gets excited around pretty ladies. Mary quickly retreated to the kitchen, rubbing her wrist. Frank remained standing, his eyes fixed on the man called Spike. You got something to say? Spike asked, leaning forward. Or are you just gonna stand there staring? Frank didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached into his pocket, pulled out enough money to cover his meal plus a generous tip, and placed it on his table. Then he looked directly at Spike. Welcome to Pinewood, he said flatly. We don't have much excitement here. Most folks prefer it that way. Spike laughed. Well, maybe that's about to change, Grandpa. Frank picked up his worn canvas jacket from the back of his chair and put it on without hurry. The movement revealed the Marine Corps eagle, globe, and anchor tattoo on his forearm for just a moment. Military man, huh? Said the third biker, speaking for the first time. He was younger than the others, with a shaved head and a scorpion tattoo crawling up his neck. My uncle was in the army, got himself killed in some desert. Sorry to hear that, Frank replied, his face giving nothing away. No, you're not, the young biker said with a sneer. You old war dogs don't care about nothing but yourselves. Frank didn't take the bait. He simply nodded to Bill behind the counter and walked toward the door, his slight limp barely noticeable as he moved between the tables. Hey, Spike called after him. We weren't done talking to you. Frank paused at the door, his hand on the handle. I was done listening. The diner remained silent as Frank left, the bell jingling softly behind him. Through the window, customers watched him walk to his old truck, climb in, and drive away. Spike turned to his companions, a slow smile spreading across his face. Boys, I think we found something to keep us entertained in this town. He pointed to Frank's departing truck. Find out who that old man is. Later that afternoon, when Frank stopped at the gas station, he noticed a black motorcycle following him from a distance. Standing by his truck as it filled with gas, he watched the biker in his side mirror, his face showing no reaction even as he recognized the young man with the scorpion neck tattoo. The first move had been made. Frank knew the game had begun. 3 days after the diner incident, Frank walked out to his driveway and discovered all 4 tires on his truck slashed. He stood quietly, examining the clean cuts that had left rubber collapsed around his vehicle's rims. This wasn't random vandalism. It was a message. Mrs. Henderson, Frank's neighbor, hurried across the street in her bathrobe. Oh my goodness, Frank. Who would do such a thing? Frank knelt to inspect one of the cuts more closely. Don't worry about it, Mrs. Henderson. Just some trouble passing through town. It's those motorcycle men, isn't it? The ones everyone's talking about. She clutched her robe tighter. Sheriff Davis should run them out of town. Sheriff's got his hands full with his wife in the hospital, Frank replied, standing up with a slight wince as his bad knee protested. I'll handle this. Mrs. Henderson frowned. But Frank, there are 3 of them, and they look dangerous. Frank just smiled slightly. I need to make some calls about these tires. You'll have a good day now. By noon, Frank had arranged for new tires and was walking the 6 blocks to Wilson's Hardware for his afternoon shift. He noticed the black motorcycle parked across from the store almost immediately. The young biker with the neck tattoo lounged against it, watching Frank approach. Rough morning, old-timer? The biker called out. Heard you had some car trouble. Frank stopped. You got a name, son? The question seemed to surprise the young man. They call me Viper. That what your mother named you? The biker's face darkened. Watch your mouth, old man. Frank nodded toward the hardware store. I got work to do. If you're buying something, come on in. Otherwise, you're just loitering. Inside the store, Mr. Wilson looked nervous. Those fellas were in here earlier, asking questions about you, Frank. What kind of questions? Frank asked as he put on his work apron. Wanted to know where you live, if you got family, how long you've been in town. I didn't tell them much. Mr. Wilson lowered his voice. They've been causing trouble all over town. Threatened Joe at the gas station when he asked them to pay for their snacks. Frank nodded. Don't worry about me. They'll move on soon enough. But they didn't move on. That evening, Frank found Spike and all 3 bikers waiting outside his house. They had parked their motorcycles on his lawn, crushing the flower bed he had carefully maintained. Nice place you got here, Marine, Spike said, flicking a cigarette onto Frank's walkway. Kinda lonely, though. No wife? No kids? Frank stopped at the edge of his property. "You're trespassing." The third biker, a heavy-set man with a red beard, laughed. "Hear that, Spike? We're trespassing." He kicked over a garden gnome, shattering it on the sidewalk. "We just wanted to check on you after your tire trouble," Spike said with mock concern. "Terrible thing that. Could happen again too." Frank's expression remained neutral. "You've made your point. Now get off my property." "Or what?" Viper challenged, stepping closer. "You gonna call the cops? Or maybe you think you can take us all on? You're just a broken-down old man." Frank looked at each of them in turn, his gaze lingering on Spike. "Last chance. Leave now." Something in Frank's voice made Spike hesitate. He studied the older man's face, noticing for the first time the complete absence of fear. After a moment, Spike nodded to the others. "Let's go, boys. The old-timer needs his beauty sleep." As he walked past Frank, he added quietly, "This isn't over. Not by a long shot." After they roared away on their motorcycles, Frank carefully picked up the pieces of the broken garden gnome. It had been a gift from Sarah years ago, one of the few items he'd kept from their life together. As he looked at the shattered ceramic in his hands, something shifted in his eyes. When Sheriff Davis finally drove by an hour later, he found Frank sitting calmly on his porch steps. "Heard there might be trouble, Frank," the sheriff said. "You okay?" Frank nodded. "Everything's fine, Sheriff. Just enjoying the evening." But it wasn't fine, and deep down, Frank knew the Desert Scorpions had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. A week of escalating harassment followed. Frank found his mailbox knocked over, received threatening phone calls in the middle of the night, and noticed the bikers following him wherever he went in town. Still, he maintained his routine: coffee at the diner each morning, shifts at the hardware store, and tending to his garden in the evenings. "Frank, you need to report this," Mary urged when he came into the diner one morning with a bruised cheek after Viper had accidentally bumped into him outside the grocery store the previous day. "Sheriff's still dealing with his wife's illness," Frank replied, sipping his coffee. "Besides, no real harm done yet." Bill leaned over the counter. "They're getting bolder, Frank. Folks are scared. They smashed up Joe's gas station when he refused to give them free beer, and nobody's seen old Pete since he argued with them about parking their bikes in his spot." Frank's eyes narrowed slightly. "Pete's missing." "Since yesterday afternoon," Mary confirmed. "Sheriff's deputy is looking for him, but," she trailed off, her worry evident. Frank paid for his coffee and left without finishing his breakfast. Instead of going to work, he drove to the outskirts of town where old Pete, a homeless veteran, usually camped. The small tent was still there, but Pete wasn't. Frank found signs of a struggle: boot prints in the dirt, Pete's overturned cart, and spilled belongings. By the time Frank returned home that evening, his anger had settled into something cold and focused. He pulled into his driveway and immediately noticed something was wrong. The gate to his backyard was open. Frank approached cautiously, years of military training coming back automatically. When he reached the backyard, he froze. Sarah's memorial garden had been destroyed. The small flower bed was trampled, plants uprooted and scattered. The protective glass case containing her photograph had been smashed, the picture inside torn to pieces and stomped into the mud. A crude message was spray-painted on the fence behind: "Old man next day." For several minutes, Frank just stood there. This wasn't the first act of vandalism to his property, but it was different. The picture had been the only recent one he had of Sarah, taken just months before her diagnosis. Everything else had been destroyed in a house fire at their old place. Mrs. Henderson found him still standing there as darkness fell. "Oh, Frank," she gasped when she saw the destruction. "This is too much. I'm calling the sheriff right now." Frank finally moved, kneeling to carefully pick up the torn pieces of the photograph. "No need for that." "But Frank." "I'll handle it," he said, his voice different than she'd ever heard it before. It wasn't loud or angry. In fact, it was quieter than usual. But there was something in it that made Mrs. Henderson step back. "What are you going to do?" she asked hesitantly. Frank stood, placing the photo fragments in his pocket. "First, I need to make a phone call." Inside his house, Frank went to his bedroom closet and pulled out a locked metal box from the top shelf. Using a key he kept on his keychain, he opened it and removed a small black notebook. He hadn't opened it in 7 years, not since he'd settled in Pinewood. Sitting at his kitchen table, Frank dialed a number from the first page. It rang 3 times before someone answered. Colonel Phillips speaking. Jim, Frank said, it's Frank Wilkins. A pause. Frank? Jesus, it's been years. Are you okay? I need information, Frank replied, ignoring the question. 3 members of a motorcycle club called the Desert Scorpions. They're causing trouble in my town. Wait, aren't you retired? What's going on? Frank's eyes drifted to his backyard where Sarah's destroyed memorial was visible through the window. They made a mistake, Jim. They thought they found an old man living alone. What they actually found was me. The next morning, Frank didn't show up for coffee at Mary's diner. By afternoon, he hadn't appeared for his shift at Wilson's Hardware either. Concerned neighbors who knocked on his door received no answer. His truck remained in the driveway, but Frank Wilkins had seemingly disappeared. Maybe he finally got scared and left town, suggested a customer at the diner. Not Frank, Bill replied, shaking his head. That man doesn't run from anything. 3 days passed with no sign of Frank. The Desert Scorpions, meanwhile, grew bolder, swaggering through town like they owned it. They took over the corner booth at the diner, demanded free drinks at the local bar, and roared their motorcycles down quiet streets at all hours. What no one in Pinewood knew was that Frank hadn't left at all. He had simply gone to work. After his call to Colonel Phillips, Frank had received everything he needed within hours. Detailed backgrounds on all 3 bikers, their criminal records, outstanding warrants, and most importantly, their routines. Spike, whose real name was Darren Mercer, had done time for assault and weapons charges. The red-bearded man, known as Crusher, real name, Lloyd Peterson, was wanted in 2 states for fraud and drug trafficking. Young Viper, Stephen Holt, had the shortest record but was on probation for theft. Frank had set up a temporary base in an abandoned hunting cabin 5 miles outside town. The previous owner, a fellow Marine, had left it to him years ago, though Frank rarely visited it. Now, it served a new purpose. On a makeshift table, Frank laid out maps of the town and surrounding areas. On the wall, he pinned photos of the 3 bikers supplied by his old contacts, along with notes about their patterns and weaknesses. He wasn't planning violence. Frank had seen enough bloodshed in his lifetime. He had something more effective in mind. During the day, Frank used binoculars to observe the bikers from various hidden positions around town. At night, disguised in a baseball cap and jacket borrowed from Bill's son, he tracked their movements more closely. He learned that they were staying at the Pineview Motel on the edge of town. He discovered that Spike kept a key to their room hidden under a loose brick near their door. He noted which local businesses they frequented and which they avoided. Most importantly, Frank learned about their motorcycles, their pride and joy. The bikes were custom-made, expensive machines that the 3 men treated better than they treated people. Every morning, they performed maintenance checks before starting their day of harassment. On the 3rd night, Frank made his first preparation. Using skills from his reconnaissance days in the Marines, he moved silently through the darkness to the motel parking lot. The motorcycles gleamed under the security lights, their owners inside the room drinking stolen beer. Frank didn't damage the bikes. That would be too obvious. Instead, he made small, nearly invisible modifications that wouldn't be noticed during a routine check, but would have significant consequences later. Next, he slipped into the motel office through a back window. The night clerk had stepped out for a smoke break, giving Frank exactly 3 minutes to access the computer. He found the bikers' reservation, noting with interest that they had paid for 2 more weeks in advance, using a credit card flagged in his background research as stolen. Before leaving, Frank placed a small device under the front desk, a voice-activated recorder borrowed from his old kit. Information was power, and Frank was gathering as much as he could. Back at the cabin, Frank studied his notes again. Tomorrow would be the day he began his real work. The bikers thought they were hunters who had cornered easy prey. They didn't realize they had stumbled into the territory of a far more experienced predator. As dawn broke, Frank cleaned his old service pistol. He didn't plan to use it, but old habits died hard. Rule 1, he murmured to himself, reciting the mantra from his training days. Always be prepared for the unexpected. The morning sun had barely cleared the hills when Spike burst out of room 14 at the Pineview Motel, kicking the door open so hard it bounced against the wall. Wake up, he shouted to his companions inside. Someone's messed with our bikes. Crusher and Viper stumbled out, still half asleep, to find Spike crouched beside his motorcycle, cursing loudly. All three bikes had fuel leaking from their tanks, forming small puddles on the asphalt. Who would dare? Crusher growled, his red beard bristling as he examined his own bike. Viper looked around nervously. You think it was that old man? Spike spat on the ground. No way, he's probably hiding under his bed by now. He stood up and kicked the nearby trash can. We need tools to fix this leak, and we need to find whoever did this. As the bikers worked to repair their motorcycles, they didn't notice the unmarked police car that pulled into the motel parking lot. Two officers in plain clothes approached the motel office, showing their badges to the manager. 20 minutes later, as the bikers finished their repairs, 5 more police vehicles arrived, blocking the parking lot exits. What the hell? Spike muttered, standing up as officers surrounded them. A tall woman in a state police uniform stepped forward. Darren Mercer, Lloyd Peterson, and Stephen Holt. I'm Captain Rivera with the state police. We have warrants to search your room and vehicles. Viper paled. How do they know our real names? Shut up, Spike hissed, then turned to the captain with a forced smile. There must be some mistake, officer. No mistake, Captain Rivera replied coolly. We received an anonymous tip about illegal weapons in your possession, and our database shows outstanding warrants for all 3 of you in multiple states. While they argued, 2 officers approached with a dog trained to detect drugs and weapons. Before the bikers could object, the dog had alerted to their saddlebags. That's not mine, Crusher protested as an officer pulled out a plastic bag containing pills. And I suppose this isn't yours either? Another officer asked, removing a handgun from Spike's saddlebag, the serial number filed off. Within minutes, Crusher and Viper were handcuffed and placed in separate police cars. Spike, however, had managed to slip away during the confusion. In the chaos of searching the room and bikes, officers temporarily lost track of him. Half a mile away, Frank watched through binoculars from the roof of the hardware store as the police cars drove away with 2 of the 3 bikers. Everything was going according to plan, including Spike's escape. Frank had counted on the man's slippery nature. That evening, Sheriff Davis visited Frank's house, surprised to find him calmly working in his garden as if he'd never been gone. Heard you were missing, the sheriff said, watching Frank carefully replant flowers in Sarah's memorial space. Just took some time to think, Frank replied, not looking up from his work. Sheriff Davis nodded slowly. Interesting coincidence. You disappear for a few days, and suddenly the state police show up with warrants for those bikers who've been harassing you. Frank finally looked up, his face expressionless. Is that so? 2 of them are in custody. The leader got away, the sheriff paused. You wouldn't know anything about that, would you, Frank? Frank stood, brushing dirt from his hands. About police business? No, sir, that's your department. He pointed to the newly replanted flowers. Coffee's fresh inside if you'd like some. As they walked toward the house, the sheriff noticed something on Frank's porch, a small duffel bag packed and ready. Going somewhere? Frank glanced at the bag. Maybe, depends on whether my work here is finished. And is it? The sheriff asked carefully. Frank looked down the street, his eyes alert. Not quite, there's still one loose end to tie up. After the sheriff left, Frank sat on his porch steps, cleaning his glasses with a handkerchief. In the distance, he could hear the angry roar of a single motorcycle engine moving closer to town. Spike was coming back, exactly as Frank had predicted. The desert dust truck stop sat 15 miles outside of Pinewood, a lonely outpost of gas pumps, a small diner, and a dusty parking lot. At this late hour, only a few long-haul trucks occupied the lot, their drivers inside grabbing coffee or a quick meal before continuing their journeys. Frank sat alone in a corner booth, a cup of coffee cooling in front of him. He had arrived an hour earlier, speaking briefly to the waitress before taking his seat. Now he waited, his posture relaxed but his eyes constantly moving, checking each entrance and every person who walked in. At exactly 11:17 p.m., the rumble of a motorcycle cut through the night air. Frank took a sip of his cold coffee and continued waiting. The door swung open a minute later, and Spike stepped inside, his face twisted with rage. His leather vest was dirty, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. It had taken him less than a day to track Frank down. You! Spike roared when he spotted Frank. The few truckers in the diner turned to look, then quickly returned to their meals, wanting no part of whatever was about to happen. Frank gestured to the seat across from him. "Have a seat, Mr. Mercer." Spike stalked over, his hand reaching inside his vest. "How do you know my real name? What did you do to my friends?" "I didn't do anything to them," Frank replied calmly. "The police arrested them based on evidence of their crimes. Please sit down." "I'm going to kill you, old man," Spike growled, pulling a switchblade from his vest. Frank didn't flinch. "Before you try, you might want to look at what's on the table." Spike's eyes flicked down to see a manila folder sitting beside Frank's coffee cup. "What's that supposed to be?" Spike demanded, the knife still in his hand. "That's a copy of a very detailed file about you and your friends," Frank explained, his voice steady. "It includes your real identities, your criminal histories, and evidence of at least 17 crimes committed across 3 states. The original file has already been sent to the FBI, state police, and 5 different county sheriff's departments." Spike's confidence wavered slightly. "You're bluffing." Frank opened the folder and turned it so Spike could see the contents. "Page 3 has photos of you selling drugs to undercover officers in Nevada last year. Page 7 details the armed robbery you committed in Colorado. Should I continue?" The color drained from Spike's face as he scanned the documents. "How did you get this?" "I made some calls," Frank said simply. "People owe me favors." Spike finally sat down, his knife now hidden under the table. "What do you want? Money?" Frank almost smiled. "I don't want anything from you. I just wanted you to understand something." He leaned forward slightly. "You chose the wrong town. You chose the wrong person to harass." "So what now?" Spike asked, his bravado crumbling. "You turn me in?" Frank closed the folder. "That depends on you. The police are already looking for you. In about 10 minutes, they'll arrive here. An anonymous tip told them where to find you." Spike's eyes darted to the door. "I could kill you right now and be gone before they get here." "You could try," Frank agreed, his calm demeanor unchanged. "But then the second part of the file gets released. The part with evidence about 3 unsolved murders in Arizona that you thought no one could connect to you." Spike's hand trembled. "Who are you? Some kind of cop?" "No," Frank replied, "just a Marine who served his country for 30 years. A man who was living a peaceful retirement until you and your friends decided to torment an old veteran and destroy the only picture he had left of his dead wife." For the first time, something like understanding crossed Spike's face. "The garden? That was." "My wife's memorial," Frank finished for him. "Sarah died of cancer 5 years ago. That picture you tore up was the last one taken before she got sick." Spike swallowed hard, suddenly seeing Frank in a new light. Not as an easy target, but as something far more dangerous, a man with nothing left to lose. In the distance, sirens began to wail. "You have 2 choices," Frank said as the sirens grew louder. "Run and spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, or face what you've done." Spike glanced frantically between Frank and the door. "They'll lock me up for years." "Probably," Frank agreed. "But people can change in prison. I've seen it happen." The sirens were close now, red and blue lights flashing through the truck's stop windows. Spike's hand tightened around the knife under the table. "I wouldn't," Frank said quietly, noticing the movement. "There are security cameras in all 4 corners of this diner. If you try anything now, you'll only add to your sentence." As if to confirm Frank's words, the waitress behind the counter pointed discreetly to the cameras mounted near the ceiling. She had been watching the entire exchange, her hand hovering near the phone. Spike's shoulders slumped in defeat. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. We just wanted to have some fun in a boring town." "Terrorizing people isn't fun," Frank replied, his voice hardening. "Destroying someone's memories isn't a game." Police cars pulled into the parking lot, their lights painting the diner walls in alternating red and blue. Officers approached the entrance, weapons ready. Spike looked at Frank one last time. "You planned all this, didn't you? From the beginning?" Frank didn't answer. He just watched as the officers entered the diner, quickly spotting and surrounding Spike. "Darren Mercer, you're under arrest," announced the lead officer, a tall woman Frank recognized as Captain Rivera. "Put your hands where I can see them." For a moment, it seemed Spike might resist, but then he slowly raised his hands, letting the knife clatter to the floor. As the officers handcuffed him and recited his rights, Spike kept his eyes on Frank. "This old man set me up," he told the officers. "He's the one who should be arrested." Captain Rivera glanced at Frank, then back to Spike. "Mr. Wilkins is a decorated Marine veteran who's been helping us track down your organization for months. He's also a personal friend of the FBI director." This last part wasn't exactly true, but Frank didn't correct her. As they led Spike away, Captain Rivera approached Frank's table. "Thank you for your assistance, sir. We've been after these guys for a long time." Frank nodded. "Just doing my civic duty." The captain smiled slightly. "Is that what you call it? My supervisor said to tell you that your old commander sends his regards." After the police left with Spike, Frank paid for his coffee and walked out to his truck. The night air was cool and clean, carrying the scent of desert sage. For the first time in weeks, he felt the tension leaving his shoulders. 2 weeks later, life in Pinewood had returned to normal. Frank was back to his usual routine: coffee at the diner, shifts at the hardware store, and quiet evenings at home. The townspeople treated him with a new respect, though no one asked for details about what had happened. Somehow, they understood that Frank preferred it that way. One Saturday morning, Frank was working in Sarah's memorial garden when Sheriff Davis stopped by. "Thought you might want to know," the sheriff said, leaning against the fence. "All 3 of those bikers took plea deals. They'll be in prison for at least 10 years. Frank nodded as he carefully placed a new framed photograph in the garden center, a restored version of the one that had been destroyed. A local photographer had managed to piece together the torn fragments and create a perfect copy. "Also," the sheriff continued, "the judge ordered them to pay restitution to everyone they harassed in town. Your share comes to about $5,000. Frank stood up, brushing dirt from his knees. "I don't want their money." "Figured you'd say that," the sheriff replied with a smile. "That's why I took the liberty of suggesting it go toward the new Veterans Memorial Park the town council's been planning." For the first time in a long while, Frank smiled. "That sounds appropriate." As Sheriff Davis left, Frank took one last look at Sarah's photograph before heading inside. The Desert Scorpions had made a critical error when they chose to target Frank Wilkins. They had seen an old man and assumed he was weak. They never understood a fundamental truth that Frank had learned during his decades of military service. True strength isn't about physical power or intimidation. It's about patience, intelligence, and knowing exactly when to strike.